long before geologists ever set foot in the Dakota Territory, and decades before the word paleontology meant anything to anyone standing on the northern plains. The Lakota already had a reason for staying out of one particular stretch of ground. Not because the land was too dry to camp on, not simply because the footing was treacherous, though it certainly was. They avoided it because something enormous had died there, and its bones were still working their way out of the earth. The Lakota called this country Makosika, a name later borrowed directly by French-speaking trappers, who translated it into their own language as mauvaises terres, the Badlands. Both names described the same brutal terrain, a maze of steep ridges, narrow gullies, and crumbling clay buttes that could swallow a full day's travel just trying to cross a few miles in a straight line. But for the Lakota, the difficulty of the terrain was only part of the reason certain stretches of it were treated so carefully. According to Lakota tradition, this jagged wind-carved country was once the site of a battle so violent it reshaped the land itself. A war between the sky and the water, ending with the body of a monstrous serpent scorched, shattered, and left to bleach across the Badlands for the rest of time. Hunters who passed near certain valleys within that country were said to slow down, lower their voices, and move on quickly, leaving offerings rather than lingering, not out of superstition dismissed lightly, but out of a caution passed down with the same seriousness as any other survival knowledge a Lakota family might carry. Then, in the early 1850s, a young scientist accompanied by a fossil hunter walked into that same broken terrain, looking for something the Sioux had already been finding and quietly respecting for generations. What they uncovered would help build the foundations of American paleontology. More than a century and a half later, one question still lingers over that stretch of the Dakota Badlands. Did the Lakota simply invent a myth to explain strange bones they stumbled across in an unforgiving landscape? Or had generations of hunters correctly identified, long before any scientist arrived with a notebook, that certain valleys held the remains of something that once truly walked, swam, or slithered across an ancient version of this land? Today we're examining the oral tradition, the early expedition records, and the buried, bone-filled valleys of a landscape the Lakota call Makosika, the land that is bad. To understand why hunters avoided this ground so deliberately, we first have to understand what the Lakota believed had happened there, long before any of their ancestors were born. According to tradition, the world was once threatened by a colossal water serpent, a being known by several names across Lakota and Dakota communities, most often remembered as Unktehila. She was described as armored in scales as hard as flint, with burning eyes capable of driving a person mad simply by looking into them, and a body said to stretch as long as 100 horses standing nose to tail. She lived in the ancient waters that once covered the plains, and as she grew in size and hunger, she began destroying everything within her reach, flooding valleys, poisoning rivers, and swallowing travelers whole. Opposing her was Wakinyan, the thunder being, whose lightning and storms existed specifically to hold her destructive power in check. For generations, the story goes, the two remained locked in an uneasy balance until Unktehila's cruelty finally grew too great to ignore. Different clans and storytellers preserved slightly different versions of what followed, as is common with oral tradition carried across many communities over centuries. But nearly every version agrees on the outcome. The confrontation between Unktehila and the forces sent to stop her was catastrophic, violent enough to permanently reshape the ground where it happened, and significant enough that its aftermath was still considered dangerous ground for every generation that followed. Before we continue, if you enjoy documentaries that explore forgotten history through oral tradition, early expedition records, and the landscapes tied to both, consider subscribing. It helps the channel and allows me to keep researching stories like this one. Because what happened next, according to Lakota tradition, is the exact reason certain valleys in the Badlands were never treated as ordinary ground again. In 1849, a geologist named John Evans traveled through the Badlands of what was then Nebraska Territory, collecting fossil fragments for a federal survey. A few years later, in the summer of 1853, A young medical school graduate named Ferdinand Hayden joined a fossil collecting expedition into that same broken country, working alongside an established paleontologist named Fielding Meek. What they found astonished the scientific community back east, scattered across the eroding hillsides, were the remains of animals unlike anything alive on the continent. Ancient camels no larger than dogs, rhinoceros-like creatures the size of small elephants, and saber-toothed predators that had vanished long before any human account of the plains began. Entire skeletons weathered directly out of the clay each time it rained, exposed by the same relentless erosion that had carved the landscape into its jagged, otherworldly shape to Hayden and Meek. This was a scientific gold mine, one of the richest fossil beds ever discovered in North America. They collected specimens by the hundreds, shipping them east to be studied by some of the era's most prominent naturalists, work that would eventually help lay the foundation for American vertebrate paleontology as a serious scientific discipline. The expedition returned to the same terrain more than once. Hayden came back in 1854, again in 1855, and once more in 1866, each time drawn to the same fossil-saturated valleys that had produced such remarkable specimens on his first visit. Word of the discoveries spread quickly among naturalists back east, and within a few years, the White River Badlands had become one of the most closely watched fossil localities in the country, described by prominent scientists of the era as a graveyard, unlike anything previously documented on the continent. But the Lakota and their Sioux relatives had noticed these same bones long before any survey team arrived with tools and crates. According to historical accounts from the period, Sioux communities living in and around this territory had been collecting fossil bones for generations, not for scientific study, but as objects of spiritual significance valued for what many described as their healing power. Elders reportedly regarded certain bones as good medicine, carrying them for protection, or using them in ceremony, treating the fossils not as scientific curiosities, but as tangible evidence of a story that had been told for as long as anyone could remember. The scientists noticed the attention their work drew as well. Hayden, in particular, became known to local Sioux communities by a nickname that stuck with him for the rest of his career, a phrase that roughly translates as the man who picks up stones while running, a reference to his rapid, almost frantic method of collecting specimens across the exposed hillsides. Some accounts suggest this behavior struck observers as so strange that it was interpreted less as foolishness and more as a kind of holiness, the unpredictable behavior of someone touched by forces beyond ordinary understanding. What neither Hayden nor Meek fully documented at the time was the deeper reason certain valleys within this fossil-rich terrain were treated so differently by the people who already lived there. The scientists were focused on cataloging bone. The Lakota were focused on remembering exactly what those bones represented, and exactly which places demanded caution rather than curiosity. That distinction becomes especially important once you consider where precisely the richest concentrations of fossil bone tended to appear, not evenly scattered across the entire Badlands, but clustered densely within specific valleys, ridgelines, and eroded basins. The very places Lakota tradition had already marked as dangerous ground. Later historical research has confirmed that much of this fossil collecting took place squarely within territory recognized as belonging to the Sioux under the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851, land the federal government and its scientific expeditions treated as open for study long before any formal agreement addressed who those discoveries, or the compensation for them, actually belonged to. None of that resolves the deeper question hovering over this landscape. Why would certain valleys, rich with the bones of animals that had been extinct for millions of years, become associated so specifically with a single violent legend passed down for generations before any scientist arrived to explain what those bones actually were? To understand why certain valleys carried such weight in Lakota memory, we need to return to the story of Unktehila and the way her final battle with Wakinyan was remembered. According to tradition, it was Wakinyan, the thunder being, who ultimately took action against her, striking the water serpent again and again with lightning as her destruction grew impossible to ignore. In some versions of the story, it is not the thunder being alone who ends her reign, but a pair of twin heroes, one sighted and one blind, guided by an old and powerful medicine woman who managed to strike the single vulnerable point on Unktehila's armored body, a hidden spot said to protect a crystal heart beneath her scales. Wounded, but not immediately killed, Unktehila did not simply lie down and die. According to the tradition, she thrashed violently across the landscape in her final agony, tearing open the earth as she went, gouging out canyons, splitting hillsides, and flattening entire ridgelines in her death throes. The jagged, eroded terrain of the Badlands in this telling is not simply the product of wind and water working slowly over millions of years. It is remembered as the physical scarring left behind by a dying monster large enough to reshape the world with her final movements. When the sun finally dried what remained of her, the story continues, her body did not decay the way an ordinary creature's would. It hardened into the land itself, becoming the long ridges of red and yellow rock that still run like a spine through the Badlands today. Her bones, according to this tradition, are not metaphorical. They are the very fossils that generations of hunters and later generations of paleontologists would find weathering directly out of the clay. That belief helps explain why specific valleys, rather than the Badlands as a whole, carried such a heavy reputation, areas where fossil bone appeared most densely, where the ground seemed almost paved with ancient remains after a hard rain, were understood not as ordinary hunting ground, but as the resting place of Unktehila's body. Ground still connected to her lingering power and to the vigilance of the thunder being who continued watching over it. This was not blind fear disconnected from practical life. Hunters still needed to move through Badlands terrain regularly, tracking game across a landscape that offered little water and even less shelter. But specific valleys, the ones most saturated with exposed bone, were treated with a caution reserved for genuinely sacred, genuinely dangerous ground, places to pass through quickly, to leave undisturbed, and never to camp within overnight. One Lakota holy man, generations later, described standing along one such ridge during a thunderstorm and feeling, beneath his feet, something that felt less like solid rock and more like the spine of a living creature, shifting under the weight of the storm above him. Whether understood literally or symbolically, the account reflects a relationship with this landscape that goes far beyond casual folklore, a living, ongoing sense that certain ground still remembers what happened there. Other tellings of the tradition extend the story even further, describing an earlier flood unleashed by Unktehila that nearly destroyed everyone, forcing survivors to climb whatever high ground they could reach until the waters finally receded. Whether treated as a single continuous narrative or as separate, overlapping stories preserved by different communities, the underlying message remains consistent. Water, in its most destructive form, was once a threat serious enough to require the direct intervention of the sky itself, and the Badlands stand as physical proof of exactly how serious that threat became. Fossils removed from these valleys were not treated as trophies or curiosities either. Communities that collected bone for ceremonial use typically did so under specific protocols, guided by medicine people who understood which remains could be respectfully removed and which ground was better left undisturbed altogether. The difference between reverent, careful use of these remains and careless disturbance of a dangerous valley was not a minor distinction. It was, according to tradition, the difference between honoring the story and inviting the same destructive power that had once required a thunder being to contain it. More than a century and a half have passed since Hayden and Meek first walked into the Badlands looking for fossils, and modern paleontology has only confirmed how extraordinary that landscape really is. Today, the White River Badlands are recognized as one of the richest concentrations of ancient mammal fossils anywhere on Earth, preserving a continuous record of life stretching back tens of millions of years, long before anything resembling the modern plains existed. Scientists now explain the region's abundance of exposed bone through straightforward geological processes, layers of ancient sediment deposited by long-vanished rivers and volcanic ash falls, later carved open by rapid, relentless erosion that continues reshaping the landscape every time it rains. From a purely geological standpoint, there is no mystery left to solve. The bones are exactly what they appear to be, the remains of extinct animals exposed by natural forces acting over immense stretches of time. But that explanation, satisfying as it is to modern science, does not erase the fact that the Lakota had already developed their own coherent account of exactly why this land was filled with the remains of enormous, unfamiliar creatures, generations before anyone arrived with the geological vocabulary to describe erosion, sediment, or deep time. Long before Western science offered its own explanation, Lakota tradition had already identified this ground as the site of something ancient, something violent, and something whose remains deserved caution rather than casual disturbance. Some researchers who study the relationship between indigenous oral tradition and paleontology have come to see stories like this one not as primitive misunderstanding, but as a genuine form of observational science, passed down through narrative rather than written record. The Lakota were not guessing blindly at scattered bones. They were building a detailed, internally consistent explanation for a real physical pattern in the landscape around them, one that modern researchers only began mapping seriously in the 1850s. That distinction matters, especially because the valley's richest in fossil bone across the Badlands remain, even today, treated with a level of reverence that goes beyond ordinary scientific interest. Descendant Lakota communities continue to regard significant portions of this land as sacred ground, not simply a fossil bed to be excavated freely, a perspective that has shaped ongoing conversations about how paleontological research in the region should be conducted and who should be consulted before it happens. History has not delivered a single tidy resolution here either. Instead, it has left behind a landscape carrying two overlapping explanations, one built from stratigraphy, radiometric dating, and comparative anatomy, and one built from generations of careful observation passed down as the story of a serpent and a storm. Both arrive, by very different paths, at the same undeniable fact. Something enormous did once live and die across this exact stretch of ground. Perhaps that convergence is the real reason certain valleys within the Badlands still command the kind of caution the Lakota once insisted upon. Not because every detail of the old story can be verified, but because the pattern the story was built to explain has never stopped being true. The bones are still there. The valleys are still unusually dense with them. And the land, however you choose to explain it, still remembers something enormous happened. What cannot be debated is that Lakota tradition identified this land as extraordinary long before any outside expedition confirmed it, and that the caution once shown by hunters moving through these valleys has outlasted every scientific survey that followed. Longer than Hayden's expedition, longer than the state of South Dakota itself, and far longer than any single theory offered to explain what lies beneath that broken, unforgettable ground. Perhaps that is why this landscape continues to fascinate the people who study it. Not because every mystery has been solved, but because every hard rain uncovers another bone and every generation returns to the same valleys and asks the same question. What exactly is still resting beneath that ground? Thank you for watching. If you enjoy documentaries that explore forgotten history through oral tradition, early expedition records, and original source material, consider subscribing for more investigations like this. And before you go, I'd like to hear your thoughts. Do you think the Lakota tradition of Unktehila was simply a story invented to explain strange bones in the ground, or could it preserve something closer to genuine, careful observation passed down long before science caught up to it? Let me know what you think in the comments, and I'll see you in the next documentary.